Ilara Voss woke up every morning before the sun did. That was simply how her life worked. While the rest of Ashvale slept under warm blankets, she was already standing in the small bakery, her hands covered in flour, her eyes still heavy with sleep. The old stone oven in the corner crackled and breathed heat into the room. The smell of fresh bread filled every corner of the shop before the first light of dawn even touched the windows. She had been doing this since she was 12 years old. The bakery was not hers by name. It had belonged to an old man named Henrik, who had found her on the doorstep of this very shop as a newborn baby, wrapped in a simple piece of cloth with nothing else. No name, no letter, no explanation. Henrik had taken her in without question, taught her everything he knew about bread and pastries and patience, and when he passed away 6 years ago, he left her the shop in a handwritten note tucked inside the oven mitt she used every single day. That was the only inheritance she ever received. The people of Ashvale knew her story, or at least the version they chose to believe. To them, she was simply the foundling girl, the girl with no family, no history, and no future worth paying attention to. They came to her bakery every morning for their loaves and their sweet rolls. They counted out the fewest coins they could get away with, and they left without meeting her eyes. She had learned not to expect more than that. What they noticed most, and what they never let her forget, was the mark on her right hand. It sat along her palm, running in faint, silver lines that curved and crossed like something carved by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Ilara had carried it since birth. She had shown it to doctors who shrugged and called it an unusual birthmark. She had hidden it under gloves during winter, and watched people stare at it during summer. Children used to point at it and whisper. Adults simply used it as one more reason to keep their distance. She stopped thinking about it the way a person stops thinking about an old scar. It was just there, part of her, as ordinary to her as her own name. The cruelty of Ashvale was never dramatic. It did not arrive in loud moments or shouting crowds. It came quietly, the way cold air enters a room through a crack in the wall. It was the merchant women at the market who took bread from her tray and dropped half the payment into her palm without looking up. It was the way the other vendors had a table at the end of the square where they sat together during slow afternoons, and that table never had a seat for her. It was the way people laughed a little too easily when something went wrong for her, and looked away a little too quickly when something went right. And then there was Davin. Davin was the son of the town's most respected elder, and he carried that fact around like a weapon he was always looking for an excuse to use. He was 25 years old and had never worked a day that inconvenienced him. He had a loud voice and a group of friends who laughed at everything he said, which had convinced him long ago that he was someone worth listening to. He made Ilara a regular target. It started small, the way these things always do. A comment here, a joke there. But over the months it had grown into something he looked forward to. He would walk through the market square on gathering days and stop at her stall like it was a show he had come to watch. Once, on a cold Tuesday morning, when she had arranged her display basket carefully on the wooden counter, he walked up, looked her directly in the eyes, and tipped the basket over into the mud with one hand. Her rolls, her sweetbreads, her morning's work, scattered across the wet ground. His friends laughed. A few passers-by looked over and kept walking. Ilara knelt down in the mud and picked up what she could save. She did not cry. She had learned that crying was something she did later, quietly, alone in the bakery after the doors were locked and the ovens were cold. In public, she simply bent down, collected what remained, and kept going. The only person who consistently stayed near her was an old woman named Marta, who sold dried herbs from a small table beside Ilara's stall. Marta was 70 years old, small and sharp-eyed. With white hair she kept tucked under a faded scarf. She never joined in when people mocked Ilara. She never laughed at Davin's performances. She would simply watch with an expression that Ilara had noticed many times, but never been able to read clearly. Something between sadness and guilt, though Ilara could not imagine why. They had shared that corner of the market for 15 years. Marta was the closest thing to family that Ilara had ever known. And then, on an ordinary Wednesday morning in late autumn, everything changed. It started as a sound, a low, steady rumble moving through the main road at the edge of town. Then it became visible, a line of large black vehicles rolling slowly through Ashvale, with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop talking and step back from the road. There were no flags, no announcements, but word moved through the market square the way it always does in small towns, fast and breathless. King Aldrich Kane was passing through Ashvale. Ilara had heard his name, as everyone in the Northern Territories had. He was the Alpha King, the ruler of all the northern lands, the last of the Caney bloodline that had governed the region for 5 centuries. He was 30 years old and had taken the throne under circumstances that the history books described as difficult, and that older people, when they spoke of it at all, described in lower voices with more complicated words. He was known to be fair, and he was known to be serious, and he was not known for stopping in small mountain towns like Ashvale for any reason at all. The vehicles slowed at the edge of the square. They stopped. One door opened, and a man stepped out who did not need to announce himself. He was tall, with dark eyes that moved across the square the way a person's eyes move when they are not sightseeing but searching. His expression was calm in the way of someone who has not been surprised in a very long time. The men who followed him stayed back at a respectful distance, watching without interfering. He walked into the market square alone. Ilara was restacking her remaining bread when she became aware that someone had stopped in front of her stall. She looked up, expecting a customer. She saw a man she did not immediately recognize, looking at her with an intensity that made her straighten. She offered him bread because that was what she did. She held out a small loaf and named a price. He did not reach for it. His eyes dropped to her right hand. He went completely still in the way a person goes still when they have stopped breathing for a moment. "Show me your hand," he said. His voice was quiet and even. Not a demand exactly, but not a request either. Something in between. The way a person speaks when they already know the answer, but need to see it with their own eyes. Ilara had heard comments about her hand her entire life, and she was not in the mood for another one. But something about the way he was looking at her made her hesitate. She turned her right hand over and held it out flat, the way she had done for doctors and curious strangers more times than she could count. She watched his face. And what she saw was not mockery or curiosity, or the mild discomfort people usually showed. What she saw was recognition, deep, certain, and completely overwhelming. He stepped back, and then, slowly, deliberately, he bent one knee to the ground. The market square did not go quiet gradually. It went quiet all at once, like a sound had been switched off. His second-in-command stepped forward immediately and said something low and urgent near his ear. Aldrich rose and turned to the man, and what passed between them in the next few minutes was short and spoken too quietly for the crowd to hear. But the second-in-command's face went pale in a way that people in the square noticed and could not explain. Aldrich turned back to Ilara. He spoke to her directly, not to the crowd, not to his men. He told her what the mark on her hand meant. He told her that it was not a birthmark. He told her it was the Caney royal seal, a mark that appeared only at birth, and only on the hand of someone born into the royal bloodline, and that it could not be copied, could not be faked, and had not appeared on anyone outside the ruling family in recorded history. Except once, 22 years ago, when a royal infant was taken out of the palace in secret during a night of crisis, handed to someone trusted, and hidden away in a place where she would be safe. He had been looking for her for years. His scholars had told him she was gone. His generals had told him to accept it. He had accepted nothing. Ilara stood on the other side of her bread counter and listened to all of this with the particular stillness of someone whose entire understanding of their own life is being rearranged in real time. She did not speak. She was not sure what she would have said. Then Aldrich turned, and for the first time, he looked out at the market square. He looked at Davin, who had gone the color of old ash. He looked at the merchant women who had underpaid for her bread for years. He looked at the people who had walked past when her basket was tipped into the mud and kept moving. He looked at all of them with the same quiet, steady expression he had worn since he stepped out of that vehicle, and he said simply that they had spent years treating with contempt a woman who, under the ancient laws of the northern bloodline, held a rank that none of them, including himself, could claim by birth. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the kind of silence that sits in the chest like something swallowed wrong. Ilara was not looking at any of them. She was looking at Marta. The old woman had not moved from her herb table, but her face had broken open in a way that Alara had never seen before, and tears were moving steadily down her lined cheeks. When Alara's eyes met hers, Marta held her gaze for a moment, and then she said the words she had clearly been holding for 15 years. She had been there that night. She had been a servant in the palace, young then, trusted with one task, to carry the infant safely and disappear. She had come to Ashvale because it was small and forgettable and far from anyone who would come looking. She had placed the baby on Henrik's doorstep because she had known him once, long ago, and she had known he was good, and she had stayed, not because she was ordered to, but because she could not leave. She had watched Alara grow up one market morning at a time, close enough to see her, but never close enough to tell her what she knew. What she owed her, she could never repay. Alara crossed the small distance between their stalls and stood in front of the old woman for a long moment. Then she put her arms around her, and Marta held on with the desperation of someone setting down something extraordinarily heavy after a very long time. In the weeks that followed, Alara did not leave Ashvale immediately. This surprised people, including some of Aldrich's men, who had expected the matter to be concluded quickly. But Aldrich himself said nothing to rush her. He returned to his convoy and gave instructions that she was to have time, privacy, and whatever she asked for. He sent no reminders. He made no appearances at her door. Alara spent those 2 weeks baking. Not because she was delaying, not because she was afraid, though she was, deeply, in the way anyone is afraid of a life that is suddenly larger than anything they prepared for. She baked because she needed to think in the only place that had ever made sense to her, surrounded by the smell of bread, and the sound of the oven, and the familiar weight of flour in her hands. She thought about what it meant to have a name that had existed before she knew it. She thought about the mark on her hand that she had apologized for, and hidden, and grown tired of explaining, and what it felt like to discover that she had never needed to apologize for any of it. She thought about Henrik, who had raised her without ever knowing what she carried, and whether he somehow would have been pleased in his quiet way to know. She thought about Marta, and what it costs a person to carry a secret out of love for someone who doesn't know they are being loved. On the morning of the 15th day, she unlocked the bakery before sunrise, as she always had. She baked one last full batch. She left everything in the back, the loaves, the sweet rolls, arranged neatly on the trays. She cleaned the counter. She folded her flour cloth. She took off her apron and hung it on the hook by the door. Then she wrote a note on a small square of paper and pinned it to the front of the shop where anyone could read it. It said, "The bread is in the back. Don't forget to pay the full price." She walked out and did not look back at the building, though she thought about it the entire way down the road. When the vehicle pulled away from Ashvale and the stone buildings began to shrink in the window behind her, Alara rested her right hand on her knee. The silver lines of the mark caught the pale morning light for a moment, the way they always had. She did not cover it. She did not move it out of sight. She simply let it be there, quiet and certain, and entirely hers, the way it had always been, waiting, all along, for the rest of the world to catch up.